In a world where ancient texts hold secrets long forgotten, one book stands out, shrouded in mystery and controversy. In ancient times, the art of writing was a sacred task, reserved for the most important of tales. Among these relics of the past lies the Book of Enoch, a text so profound it has puzzled scholars and believers for centuries. But who was Enoch? An ancestor of Noah, he was known for walking with God, only to suddenly vanish mysteriously one day. Did he pen these words, or do they speak through the voices of many ancient authors? From tales of angels and giants to prophecies of apocalypse and salvation, the Book of Enoch is a journey through the unknown. Does it hold the key to our past and our future? Join us as we unravel the mysteries of the Book of Enoch and explore its impact on our world today. From theology to history, from myth to reality. Stay tuned as we embark on this incredible journey. Subscribe, share, and prepare to have your view of history transformed.
In ancient times, so few people could read and write that things weren't typically written down unless it was very important. When examining ancient documents today, we ask several questions. Is it important? Is it fact or fiction? Who wrote it? And most importantly, why was it written? What was it meant to do? The true stories and even the myths told throughout history have worked together to shape the world as it is today. And one of these ancient texts is the Book of Enoch. You may have heard of the Book of Enoch before, but not many people have stopped to ask, why did someone take the time to write this? I believe this literary work is still important and that it's still affecting humanity today. In this video, I'm going to attempt to explain how, but I'm also going to be answering the question that many Christians are asking. Should I read it? Is it safe? Is it helpful? Debates have circled around this mysterious document for centuries, and no wonder, since the book is full of seemingly crazy content, such as vivid and outlandish depictions of the apocalypse and fallen angels. Is this book based on fact? Or is it an elaborate work of fiction? And what kinds of answers are hidden in its fantastical tales? It was certainly written as if the author believed it to be a historical account of real experiences. But how can we know? And whether it is true or make-believe, how is it still affecting us today? Let's find out. 1947. A trio of teenage shepherd boys were tending their goats near the ancient settlement of Qumran when they found a cave in the side of a nearby cliff. As a typical teenager would do, one of them threw a rock into the cavern and was surprised to hear a shattering sound. Upon further investigation, the boys found a collection of ancient scrolls tucked inside multiple clay jars. Word got out, and soon enough, archaeologists were quick to descend on the site. What they discovered inside was more than just some old jars, but a collection of written works that would change Christianity and even the cultural view of the Bible forever. Today, these are known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, believed to be recorded onto parchment sometime between 200 and 150 BC. There are 11 manuscripts that were found in 12 different caves over a span of 70 years. Not only have they verified significant portions of the modern Bible, but they have helped us better understand an obscure time in history. Among these manuscripts was the Book of Enoch. So why were remnants of this book included in a secret stash of manuscripts that most Christians believe to be legitimate sources of Scripture? Does it hold equal value, or was it just a bonus? And does its inclusion make it a legitimate historical account? So who is Enoch really? Perhaps understanding the man a little bit better can help us to justify the significance of his story. Enoch was the father of the oldest living man on earth, named Methuselah, and grandfather to the world-famous Noah. Genesis 5:24 says, "Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him." This supernatural legend is known as being translated, a curious term that basically means being taken from one place to another. But this begs the question, if God suddenly took him away, where did he go? Most Christians assume that he was taken to heaven, but the Bible doesn't say where he went. However, the Book of Enoch has a few suggestions, which we will get to shortly. But at this point in our story, it's important to note that Enoch probably didn't write this book himself. It's named Enoch, sure, but the same way many scholars believe Isaiah didn't write the entire book named after himself, experts generally agree that Enoch is not the man who put the quill to the parchment.
So why is it called the Book of Enoch? It's because the story is told from Enoch's perspective. In ancient times, it was actually quite normal for authors to write from the perspective of a well-known figure.
This is called pseudepigraphical work, and was generally considered a type of retelling of history. Some historians think this may have even been the case with the Book of Daniel, and potentially the second book of Peter. There's also evidence that the Book of Enoch had multiple authors. It may be a collection of various writings pieced together, which is why there seems to be some incongruency in the structure and flow. Whether Enoch is fact or fiction, it's obvious that it's at least told from various perspectives. The most common belief is that the Book of Enoch is simply a verbal legend, passed down through generations until it was finally written down. This is supported by the notion that in the 4th section of the book, the author quite literally tells us that Enoch passed the story along verbally to his son Methuselah. But just because it is legend does not necessarily make it untrue. So, what is the Book of Enoch about?
For the sake of this video, when I say the Book of Enoch, I'm actually talking about 1st Enoch. Yes, there are 3 of them. 2nd and 3rd Enoch are generally considered very distinct materials from the 1st. While the 1st book is believed to have been written hundreds of years before Christ, the other 2 seem to be written after Christ. The 2nd book includes some language that insinuates that it was possibly written before the destruction of the Jewish temple in 70 AD, yet the 3rd book seems to be written after that occurrence. So with all of that in mind, what is the book of 1st Enoch about? First, the text introduces itself as the words of Enoch meant for a future generation of quote-unquote elect individuals. It describes Enoch as a righteous man who saw God. It then dives into prophecy, using similar structure and language to that of the prophets of the Bible. The story itself is generally broken up into these 5 distinct sections. Enoch and the fallen angels.
The Book of Enoch gets weird real fast. Specific angels called the Watchers make a pact together to come down to earth and have relations with human women. They do this as well as teach the humans about charms and the effects of some plants. The women give birth to the Nephilim, or giants, who grow up to be unimaginably violent. There is so much darkness and destruction that God sends a great flood to cleanse the earth. Enoch is then shown around the different parts of the earth, seeing a river of fire and a dark mountain, sweet-smelling trees, the corners of the earth where the winds come from, and portals opening to heaven.
The parables.
This is a section of parables on the end of the world, including the judgment of the righteous and the sinners. Enoch describes the elect standing before the Lord of Spirits and the 4 chief angels praising the Lord. The Lord speaks to Enoch about how he will bring the elect into his throne room to dwell with him forever. Then Enoch sees the Son of Man, having the appearance of a man, but a face full of graciousness. And he goes on to describe a fountain of righteousness that never stops flowing. Enoch is carried off to mountains with precious metals and hears secrets about the last days of earth.
Enoch visits the heavenly luminaries.
The 3rd section largely tells us of what Enoch sees in the cosmos, traveling between many portals to see the different areas of the heavenly luminaries. He explains the movements of the sun, moon, and stars, and how they dictate the passage of time, the seasons, and weather of the earth. Once again, he ends with prophecy of the last days of the earth.
The Lord of the Sheep.
The 4th section in the Book of Enoch details Enoch telling his son Methuselah of his visions, this time about animals. Bulls bearing calves, wolves chasing sheep, great carnivorous birds scooping up the lambs, and the sheep eventually being saved by the Lord of the sheep. It is believed to essentially describe the persecution of the Jewish people,
as well as future events seen in the Christian New Testament, such as the coming of the Messiah and the inclusion of the Gentiles into the faith, the end times.
The fifth and final section fully focuses on the apocalypse, describing the blessings to be poured out on God's people and the punishment of evil. Its language is very like the language of the prophets of the Bible, describing the roots of evil being cut off and the plant of righteousness growing, the old heaven passing away and a new heaven being even brighter, and many different pictures of the unrighteous being destroyed and the righteous being saved.
With just these brief descriptions of what's actually included in the Book of Enoch, it's very easy to see why it has stirred up so much controversy. Within Christianity, the Book of Enoch was ultimately omitted from the canon of Scripture, but many people are asking the question today, was the early church wrong to exclude it? And others have raised the question, could it have been left out on purpose in order to hide important information from people today? To help answer these questions, let's dive into some of the theories surrounding this book.
While some people say the Book of Enoch influenced New Testament literature, others take the exact opposite view, saying that the writers of Enochian literature stole from the other scriptures. This could suggest that perhaps pieces of the book were true, such as Noah and the flood, but that the work itself is fictional. Others feel that the book should not be totally dismissed from historical or religious context, as it somewhat prophesies the coming of the Messiah. There are also many similarities to John's revelation in the Bible. Enoch being taken to heaven and seeing the throne room of God, of describing visions and prophetic warnings of the future and the end times, are comparable to John's experience. Yet, one major difference between Enoch and the New Testament writings is the focus and the tone. While the Book of Enoch tends to focus on very sensationalistic ideas such as angelology and demonology, the New Testament writers focus on the redemptive work of Jesus and God's purpose for the church on the earth today. Now, the Book of Enoch cannot be completely discounted from all scriptural context because it is actually referenced, or at least alluded to, in the New Testament books of Jude, 1st and 2nd Peter, and Hebrews. But why would Scripture reference it without including it? Some who believe that Enoch should be canonized point to the fact that Jesus himself actually seems to refer to the Book of Enoch in Luke chapter 20, even going so far as to call it Scripture. But though it is likely, it's not 100% provable that Jesus really was referencing Enoch. Also, Jesus and the disciples lived at a time when a particular Greek translation of the scriptures called the Septuagint was used predominantly in Jewish study, and it actually included much of what we know to be the Book of Enoch. So perhaps Jesus was simply referencing it in the context of a religious text that those he was speaking to would recognize.
So how does the Book of Enoch impact us today? I want to answer this question for those who don't consider themselves Christians first. And secondly, I'm going to answer this question for Christians as well. The Book of Enoch tells stories that mirror some biblical accounts, such as the fall of the angels and the flood.
Some people would say that multiple ancient writers coming up with stories like the flood that are similar but not exactly identical is evidence that those events are a myth and never really happened. But I would say that the opposite is true. The more ancient writers and storytellers who wrote about the same events, especially when all those writers didn't get together for a brainstorming session, the more evidence there is that those things they were writing about are actually true. When a cataclysmic event occurs, you don't just see one news station reporting about it. They all cover it. The more writings we discover from the ancient world that point to a real worldwide flood or the interaction with angels and demons, the more evidence there is that something similar really did occur.
So I believe that the Book of Enoch is just one piece of a very large puzzle. So if you've made it this far into the video, I hope you'll subscribe and even share this video and come back for more. But I'm about to answer this question from a Christian perspective because many Christians have a lot of questions about the Book of Enoch. Should we read it? Is it safe to read? I don't know, right? So these are my personal opinions. So I would encourage you, if you're a believer, to pray about this for yourself as well, and don't just take my advice as solid fact, but rather seek out these answers for yourself as well in Scripture and in prayer. This would be my first point, is that I believe that Enoch should not be considered Scripture. And the reason is because I believe that God orchestrated what books made it into the Christian Bible, and that even if people wanted to keep books out of the Scriptures for various reasons, whether to hide information or whatever, they are not powerful enough to do that. I believe God protected the Scriptures over history and throughout time. And now I do know that there are different versions of the Scriptures that are debated. There's the Protestant Bible, there's the Catholic Bible, right? And then there are also variations believed by some to be true, but are generally considered wrong, such as the Mormon Bible. So I'm not saying that everything people call Scripture is Scripture, but I believe, generally speaking, God has protected His Word, and He's given it to us the way it is for a reason. Now, is it okay to read the Book of Enoch? Yes, it is not going to hurt you to read that book. Yet, this would be my suggestion, is that you would simply pray about it before doing so if you haven't already read it. Because it may be okay for some Christians to read, but it might not be wise for everyone to read at this time. Especially if you're a new believer, if you've only been saved for a little while, it's probably best just to immerse yourself into the Scripture, see what God calls truth, learn that, believe that before you go looking at some of the other things out there that could influence your perspective of the Scripture. But at the same time, is it okay to read other things? Absolutely. So why wasn't it included in the canon? Does that make it completely false? Not necessarily. And like I said in this video, there are several references to the Book of Enoch from the actual Scriptures themselves. And the Book of Jude itself even says that Enoch prophesied, and then it even quotes some of his prophecy, or some of the prophecy from the Book of Enoch, depending on how you view that. And here's the reason why Scripture can quote that without including it as Scripture. It is because not all prophecy is Scripture itself. And we see that in the early church writings. If you actually go and look at some of the very highly respected early church leaders after the first century, you see that very shortly after the apostles were gone, they already made a distinction between some of the prophecies that were being shared in the church and the Scripture itself. It's really cool to see how some of the early church pastors and leaders would say, hey, here's a writing that I believe was inspired by God that I'm sending to you to encourage you as a local body, yet they would include lines like this: do not hold this to the same level that you hold the writings of Paul. Or they would imply, please don't consider this as being inspired at the same level that these other letters were. So we already see that there was a distinction and a difference between something God considered Scripture and something that was simply the prophetic gift being used in the body to build up the church. And there are many examples of this, not just in the early church, but in Scripture as well. There was even a famine predicted by a prophet in the New Testament, yet that prophecy itself does not get included in the Scripture. So right there, we can see that the Scripture itself makes a distinction between the Scripture and prophecy. The same thing happened in the Old Testament. We see there's a school of the prophets during the time of Elijah and Elisha, and yet at the same time, whatever prophecies they were sharing were not included in the Scripture itself. So the Scripture makes a distinction between prophecy and the Scripture, and we should too. So therefore, the Book of Enoch, even though it's not included in the Scripture, there could be legitimate prophecy within that book. Yet I personally believe one of the reasons why it wasn't included was simply because it probably is not completely accurate. Maybe there are parts of it that are inspired by God and that are true, and maybe there are other parts that were either not important for people to know or just simply not from the Lord. So I believe that books like this can absolutely affect the way we see things like fallen angels, like the Nephilim, ancient artifacts, ancient technology. But at the same time, even though our perspective can be influenced by these books, what we consider truth should be rooted and grounded in Scripture itself. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you're interested in learning more about the Nephilim, I've made another video similar to this one all about that topic, and that link is going to be below. See you next time.